The Senate has passed a bill enforcing a tentative rail labor agreement, but our next guest says he voted to extend deliberations and would prefer Congress doesn't play a role in the dispute. Join us now, Senator Pat Toomey, lead Republican on the Banking Committee. Strange bedfellows. I felt the same way initially, Senator. It's like you get a union 20 years, maybe the working man doesn't get a fair shake, let's say. That's the reason we have unions. Finally, we're in a tight labor market. They've got some leverage. Suddenly, it's like Congress decides and former union backers decide, hey, now that you've got some power, we're going to just pull the rug out from underneath you and legislate against it. But then again, Senator, you know that in the real world, we can't let the economy shut down.
Yeah, I get that. I think there was no great outcome here in terms of the choices before the Senate. But one thing I'm pretty sure of, it's a really bad idea for Congress to reopen agreements and decide to nitpick on individual provisions.
Okay.
How do we know the relative importance and what concessions were made on any given particular item? And you saw Bernie Sanders' amendment to create, what, 8 paid sick days or something. It almost passed. And the more Congress gets involved in settling these kind of disputes, the more ridiculous the outcomes are going to be, where I have no idea whether that's appropriate policy on top of all the other paid absent days. I mean, we just don't know this. We shouldn't be in this space.
So let's say everybody had gone along with you on the Republican side of things and the thing shut down. Did you, is that what you wanted?
No, that's not what I want.
So you're able to have a principled vote because you know other people are going to...
No. When I said it's not what I wanted, what I mean to say is that a strike is not what I wanted, but we don't know that that's what the outcome would have been. The failure of Congress to force the agreement might have caused the two sides to change their relative negotiating position, so we don't know.
So you really wish that it had not succeeded?
Yeah, and then there'd be an awful lot of pressure on these guys to come to an agreement.
What if it actually shut down the railway system and did that to the tune of $2 billion a day plus in damage to the United States? I mean, the number of people
look,
that
at some point we'd have to intervene. I get that. I just think it's important to make the point that this is a bad direction.
But then do you consider your vote symbolic?
That's what I said, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
you can do it because other people weren't doing it.
To some degree, yeah, this was clearly going to pass, and they had the votes. I'm trying to make the point that Congress shouldn't be the one deciding the terms of employment between two private sector actors.
It's going to go so many places. We want to go to crypto and FTX, but just initially I was thinking, Fetterman's taking your place. You glad you retired? Or you think that was can you take it back?
I'm glad to be retiring. I have no regrets about that decision. The outcome in my state is not what I had hoped it would be.
You're still young.
Thank you.
I hope you got I hope you got some good plan. What are you doing that's so great?
So I have no plan. The last thing I wanted was to have some kind of conflict of interest. So I've no discussions, no negotiations. We're about 4 weeks away from the end of my term. At that point, I hope to have lots of conversations.
You're going into crypto?
I don't know about that.
No, kidding. Tell us about what we need. What happened there? I mean, did we drop the ball in this country on why?
Because you've always liked crypto.
Look, I think the underlying technology is fascinating and very powerful. I think of these protocols as operating systems on which people are developing all kinds of fascinating programs that are going to allow us to do things that we've never been able to do before. So what I want is a sensible regulatory environment so that there's certainty that you're not breaking a law, you know whether or not your project involves a security, so you know whether or not you got a problem with the SEC. I've got a stablecoin bill that's a kind of simple, discrete part of this ecosystem where we could provide certainty and really help. But the failure of Congress to do that and of the regulators to provide clarity is part of what's driven activity offshore to places like the Bahamas, where you don't have the consumer protections that we would take for granted here. And here's the other thing that's really important, which is why I'd like to do a hearing and bring SBF in before the Senate Banking Committee. I have colleagues who are choosing to use this explosion as their opportunity to blame crypto and paint this whole ecosystem with one broad brush. This is about the outrageous behavior of an individual and maybe a few individuals, but it has nothing to do with the underlying asset, right? We've seen this play out how many times with fiat assets?
Well, let me ask you a question, though. So it depends what we think happened inside of FTX. Part of it may very well have been this commingling of the assets.
Certainly looks that way.
Looks that way, which unto itself would be a problem, and a problem whether it was crypto or anything else.
Right.
There's a secondary issue, which is the way in which some of these currencies have been used as collateral, whether they're really currencies at all, the way the float worked, how they work.
Yeah.
And so, no, but I do think there's some underlying questions about what these things even were.
Or how they're used, right? I mean, the FTX coin, FTT. Very dubious value, right? What's supporting that? What's the underlying reason why there's value in that token? I would be very skeptical about it, right? I'm actually skeptical about lots of.
And so tokens. Then what would you do? So, but here's the question: if the U.S. looks at it, looks at the FTT token and says, "Yeah, we can't deal with this," so, then it's going to live in the Bahamas, right?
No, I don't think so. I think so. First of all, our regulatory regime should be about disclosure, making sure that investors understand the risk they're taking, and then you let them do what they're going to do. It should not be to protect people from themselves. So if we had that kind of clarity, there would be lots of options in this space where people could participate with sensible, regulated companies, and I don't think these offshore projects would be as successful.
The issue with what happened at that exchange, you think there were crimes committed here?
So I'm not a lawyer. I think so, but it was offshore, and so the extent of the jurisdiction of the SEC is a question in my mind. Likewise with the Justice Department, but it certainly looks to me like had this been done in the U.S., there'd be all kinds of crimes.
If we were to regulate it in the United States, who should do it? Is it the SEC?
So that's a real challenging question. So in my view on stable coins, I don't think that is the realm of the SEC. I think the OCC is a more appropriate regulator, and my legislation contemplates that. I think some tokens look and are used like securities, and they probably ought to be regulated by the SEC. Truly decentralized platforms where there is no central authority, there is no intermediary, there is nobody in charge because it's software that was released onto the web, that doesn't look like a security to me.
What about just the exchanges themselves?
Exchanges themselves.
Who should be regulating that? Because there's so much investor money that's stored up here. It seems like just the SEC's purview of protecting investors could pretty easily.
I think you can make a good case, provided that we set a separate set of guardrails, because there's a lot of things that are different about crypto, right? I mean, settlement and custody, like for instance, is obviously very different than, say, stocks and bonds.
But just the idea that you shouldn't be able to commingle funds.
Right, commingling funds, you shouldn't be able to front run your customer's order. There's basic
having some sense that yes, my money is safe here, because you had some big investors, sophisticated investors, who got really sucked in by some of this stuff.
Yeah. No, I do think you could have a set of very common sense trading regulations that we would all agree on.
Senator, the political landscape affects the economy and business news. Stop the presses. So I'm going to lead into that. So I think of Georgia the first time around, and if that had been different, and the laws that have been passed since then, think about that. Because they had, Vice President Harris had to break the tie for the 50-50. A lot of those things would not have happened. Okay.
Right.
Has the Republican Party crossed the Rubicon in terms of Donald Trump?
The way I think about it is, I think it was always very likely that President Trump's influence would wane. Frankly, it wasn't happening.
But it was like 9 lives. It was a cat almost with.
But it was waning prior to the election. I think the election of last month accelerated this process.
You had Republicans saying, "I'm tired of losing," 3 times.
Well, and that's a big problem. And as we chatted briefly earlier, the data is like overwhelmingly clear. The ultra pro-Trump candidates who are all about election denial and relitigation.
Well, no one knows that better than you.
Those guys went down in flames, and often at the same time that in the same state, on the same day, a more conventional Republican.
You think McCormick would have won? You think McCormick would be senator in Pennsylvania, Andrew?
In possibly. had he been in that?
I think
that
he would
spot?
be. I think he'd be senator.
Well, so I think Dave McCormick is a great guy and would have been a great candidate. I think Dr. Oz was a good candidate. The problem we had in Pennsylvania was the top of the ticket, the gubernatorial nominee.
Well, that's okay. Whatever you want to blame it on, but that guy, yeah,
he lost by 15 points. In Pennsylvania, it's a blowout if you lose by 8 or 9. We're a very narrowly divided state. With that much headwind at the top of the ticket, it did damage all the way down the ballot. There were 3 House seats that we could have picked up, would have, if it had just been a normal outcome at the top of the ticket.
I mean, you've had this viewpoint for a while, and I'm just wondering, that was what my question was. This time, is it different?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I think so, because this time, it's just so clear, and it manifested in so many states.
Do you think that, God almighty, do you think, spoiler, you think that would become a role?
I don't know, right? Who knows what Donald Trump's going to do.
What do you think? Would you ever see anything like, I see this as probably not the way I want things to go for the Republican Party or the country, so I'm going to step aside? Could you ever see the day when that?
Not for that reason, but if he came to the conclusion that he's not on a path to win, I think he might find a reason to get out rather than go ahead and lose, because he probably figures he can't pull off the story twice.
All right. You want to be a CNBC contributor after you leave?
Sure.
He can't negotiate these things in his current role.
Oh, that's right. That's right. That's right. Okay. All right. All right. All right. All right. You're right. You're right. You're right. I'll take it back.
The red light is on the camera.
Senator Toomey, thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Nice to see you.
Great to see you guys.